Something I cannot understand is just how quickly the reception for the Silent Hill 2 remake has taken a total 180 to overwhelmingly positive reviews. It's as if people are only praising this game to the high heavens because it's not the hot garbage that was initially expected. I guess when you have the bar so low, it's easy to be impressed by the bare minimum. People love the game now, but give it a month for a few more and the game's flaws will be discussed, then the fanbase will act like it's a revelation that the remake they're pretending is perfect actually isn't so flawless after all. I don't know, call me cynical if you want, but I see people already pushing back against any criticism towards this game, making ridiculous comparisons, and it just makes me feel like discussing this game is gonna be pretty miserable. Personally, I was never quite as apprehensive towards the Silent Hill 2 remake, but I played through the series for the first time earlier this year, and I wasn't quite as crazy about the original as everyone else was. Not to say that I don't understand why it's so beloved, because the story, characters, and atmosphere are top-notch, just that I felt the gameplay held me back from enjoying it quite as much as I hoped I would. It's much more laid back as a survival horror game, incredibly forgiving actually, as you're pretty much never gonna run out of ammo or health pickups. It can also be particularly cryptic and you're bound to get lost and have to open up your map like 50 times, but I don't know. I guess replaying this game has given me more to appreciate because yeah, the combat sucks, it's clunky and janky, stomping just doesn't work at times for no apparent reason, the levels mostly consist of long hallways with more and more doors to check, the enemy variety and bosses are also lacking, but it's kinda charming in that way. I mean, the town alone was something so captivating to me throughout the original trilogy. I sorta prefer the vibe of the original game's town over SH2's for a couple reasons, mainly because its atmosphere was so good for a PS1 game. I also think SH2's impact was lessened for me since SH3 and Origins aim for a similar atmosphere with their renditions of the town, but it's still good and I certainly still love exploring Silent Hill. And I haven't even mentioned the unforgettable cast of characters. I can't say that the performances given from the voice actors are perfect, but that's not to say there's nothing to be derived from Guy See's portrayal of James, no matter what the fanbase wants to tell you. There are a lot of silly scenes and line deliveries, like I'm sure you all know that this town is in fact full of monsters. How could you sit there and eat pizza? There's just a lot to unpack from this game, so while I would say that Silent Hill 2 is flawed, I enjoy it in spite of its flaws and appreciate what Team Silent was able to do with this story. So the choice of remaking Silent Hill 2 always came off as a strange one to me. It would make more sense to start with the original game since it isn't available on any modern platforms unless you emulate it. Even with its issues, Silent Hill 2 didn't need a remake nearly as much as 1 or 4, which would have been far more interesting. Of course, Silent Hill 2 and 3 are among the most popular games in an already niche series, so I can understand it better from a business standpoint, but even still, I was cautiously optimistic. Leading up to release, I was actually really excited to jump into it, not just because it's a new survival horror game, but because maybe I would be surprised at just how much they could actually improve upon the original. In some ways I think I was right, but in a lot of other ways, I honestly think this game offers a worse experience than the original. First impressions were strong though, as the game looks great. I'm not super impressed by realistic graphics, but seeing the town get a major glow up warmed my cold heart. There's some neat details that come from the graphical upgrade though, like James's missing wedding ring and how he progressively gets dirtier and more tired throughout the game, or how Angela's nails are torn up from her nervous habit of biting them. There's even a cute nod to the infamous Comic Sans sign from the HD collection hidden out of bounds, which is something they didn't have to do, but is incredibly funny that they chose to do it anyway. Unfortunately, the game's performance is where things take a turn. Even on higher end PCs, the game has a frequent issue of stuttering. It can get particularly bad in some of the indoor maps, which not only detracts from the immersion, but got so bad at points that I found myself getting mildly motion sick. There has been a recent patch to remedy the performance, so I'm hoping that further updates will only see the game reach the standards it should have been at in the first place. Something I was very curious about was how the town would be expanded, as there were promises of new buildings to explore. One of my favorite parts of any Silent Hill game is exploring the town because it feels like a real quiet town you'd stop by on a vacation. There is some charm to the additions, but ultimately I thought they were actively detrimental not just to the experience, but to the game's pacing. By the hour-and-a-half mark of my replay of OG SH2, I was already out of the apartments, and that was while I was taking my time exploring. In the remake, that's about when you arrive to Woodside. The problem is that the new content just feels like padding, because now you're sent off on a fetch quest to fix a jukebox by collecting a button and 2 halves of a vinyl. It doesn't feel like anything the original was missing, it's just content for the sake of content. There's a couple of new puzzles which are equally weak, like the keypad puzzle or the cash register, which I question the purpose of. You just interact with the key inserted to open it, and that's it. It's like, it's not even a puzzle. It's so confusing to me, particularly because there's a receipt you can find by going through the apartment building on Saul Street to get to this small store. There's no significance to the receipt other than maybe tying into some of the memos or strange photos you pick up, but it could have been used as a code to unlock the register. Or alternatively, they could have just left the key sitting on the counter. I don't know, maybe I'm just being nitpicky, but the town puzzles kinda suck. Thankfully, they do get a little bit better throughout the game, but that didn't give off the best first impression. Something else new, you can break open the windows of stores and cars for resources or to open up new paths, which I find hilarious. Just the idea of a guy like James running down the street smashing open every last window he can find is really funny. Speaking of, the game is about as forgiving with its distribution of heals and ammunition as the original game was. It almost strikes a better balance since the combat is more involved and as a result, a bit more difficult now, but I never found myself desperate for health drinks. Combat initially seems like a definite improvement gameplay-wise since it actually requires some brainpower this time around. As opposed to the original where you'd have to back up and wait for an opening to spam the attack button, now you have a few more things to consider. You've got a dodge which gives very generous iframes, and you can shoot enemies in the knee to stagger, which shifts the focus of combat to being more focused on your timing. I will give the team props for making the mannequins into a more memorable enemy, and the original mannequins were very quiet and didn't move at all unless you got close enough, cementing them as just a weaker and less interesting version of the lying figures. In the remake, they built upon their silent nature by making them hide off in the odd corner to jump scare the player with a sudden attack. It becomes this funny little game of figuring out where they're hiding, and at times it didn't feel like they were even trying, but I thought it was a really creative spin on the enemy. But like I said, while I didn't hate the combat initially, it's the same exact cycle with every encounter. Shoot in the knee, pipe him, stomp him, knee, pipe, stomp, knee, pipe, stomp, knee, pipe, stomp, knee, pipe, stomp, and it's just so boring. It feels like an action game in denial of being an action game, which is the antithesis of what a Silent Hill game should be. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you the original game's combat is better mechanically, but the shallow improvements open up a whole new can of worms which weren't an issue in the original game. The biggest issue with the original combat to me was the enemy variety, or lack thereof. Combat was never a focus of the original game, it was only there to add to the atmosphere and work in tandem with the underlying themes and story. Even though it was much easier and jankier, you didn't spend a lot of time fighting enemies, and the game was like half as long as the remake. They've somehow managed to make the combat more dreadful than in the original, because you fight the same enemies over and over again with very little variation. Each of the OG enemies has a new variant, and the Mandarin, which originally just kinda sat beneath grates, can now attack you, but I think this game needed at least 2 or 3 more new enemies to mix things up. Nonetheless, the RE4 remake inspiration is so damn obvious in this game, and it takes away from a lot of what made the original game feel so special. For one thing, the camera perspective was one of the most important distinctions between Silent Hill and any other survival horror game from the era. There were some fixed camera angles, but you had slightly more control over your own camera. The new perspective certainly makes it a more immersive experience, which is fine to an extent, as the original was immersive in its own way, but I kinda miss its pulled back camera. In the original, picking up items was as easy as walking up to and selecting it. James's head would even turn in the direction of interactable objects and items, which made them easier to spot. In the remake, items are often out of view of the camera, meaning you have to look around a lot more, especially if you're in search of the strange photographs or some of the hidden ending items. James can still turn his head, but it's harder to notice, and I often thought he was looking at something whenever he wasn't. This probably sounds like nitpicking, but it's little things like this that can add up to increase playtime by more than you might expect. I mean, this plus the window shattering entirely changes how I explored the town and any other environment. I almost always felt like I was about to miss an important item, and when the game averages 12 to 18 hours if you're taking your time exploring, it hurts a lot to know you missed one photograph that you can't go back and grab now. And that's another thing, this game does not need to be as long as Resident Evil 4. I'm aware you can beat it much faster than that, but casual runs of a survival horror game shouldn't take any longer than 8 hours, especially not a Silent Hill game. What's up, Editing Wyrlwind here to interject real quick. I just want to say I do kind of disagree with what I said there a little bit, because there are some exceptions to the length of survival horror games being an issue for me, like for example Resident Evil 4, but that's because it's more an action horror game than a survival horror game. It has more elements to it that doesn't make it quite as repetitive, you know, because of its length. I do think it varies a lot from game to game, so I just wanted to clear that that up real quick. The pacing feels all out of whack here. By the time I reached the other half of the apartments, I was honestly a little confused because it felt like they should have been done and over with already. The labyrinth definitely has it the worst though. Of all the areas you could choose to expand, I have no clue why they'd pick the labyrinth, as it was always the most boring area in the game to me, and it's no different here. And now we have 3 different flavors of it: rotten, desolate, and ruined, each of which lacks the visual distinction from what we've already seen up to this point, doesn't have much in terms of scare factor, and has a really dragged out combat section. Seriously though, why is this combat section here? It just feels like something out of a Resident Evil game, and it doesn't work because this combat doesn't work in tight spaces. You have no melee options, no grenades or what have you, and to be clear, I don't want that, but it quickly turns this section into running in circles looking for enemies to point and shoot at. Dodging does help since it gives generous iframes, but that doesn't feel like a true solution when the level design is the problem. You shouldn't have to change the moveset to accommodate the area should already accommodate for the moveset. Like I said earlier, if they wanted to turn Silent Hill 2 into an action game, I'd much rather them have fully sent it rather than to be at their own throat over it constantly. Again, it's not like I want Silent Hill 2 to be an action game since it defeats the point, but man, just choose one way or the other. This back and forth design is annoying and not fun. The only improvement here could have been the abstract daddy fight, but that's not so much a part of the labyrinth anymore as it's been moved to just before the beginning of the area. I did really like how they changed this fight as well as the other bosses, given they actually have substance beyond running around in circles now. They're not perfect still, especially abstract daddy, given the iframe situation makes his one attack up until the final phase incredibly easy to dodge, but it's a much more impactful segment than in the original at least. For sure, the biggest improvement to any boss though is the Eddie fight. The original Eddie boss is infamous for being total dog shit, and I can't blame anyone for disliking it, but I always thought it was a cool idea that was held back given it wasn't quite like anything else in the series, and the remake absolutely proves that. I feel like this is the one point in the game in which the original idea was fully realized because it builds on what was there in such a natural way and makes the tone of the fight much creepier and keeps you on your toes, since Eddie is much quicker to run off and hide after being hit. And the way the fight progresses with each phase is just so good. It becomes so much more tense, and the atmosphere as well as the music do a fantastic job of elevating it. This should be the bar for Silent Hill boss fights going forward. Going back to the level design though, the remake is much more streamlined than the original, which isn't necessarily a bad thing given its length, though I always thought getting lost and having to find your way was just a part of the experience. It wouldn't be a Silent Hill game if you didn't have to open your map like 50 times, and to be fair, I did end up doing that a lot anyway because I would frequently get turned around, but in general, it's much easier to find your way in the remake. A lot of the new and remade puzzles don't help with this much, though there are a handful that stumped me a bit. I liked the redone coin puzzle for one, and the grandfather clock bit was alright, though one of my favorites from the original, the gallows puzzle, was a little weaker than I was hoping it would be. I wouldn't say there are any puzzles outside of the first hour or two that are downright bad, but I don't think many of them were quite as satisfying to solve as in prior entries. Something I was expecting going into the remake though was a lack of subtlety in the writing, and unfortunately, I don't think I was entirely wrong. I don't mind them trying to build on Maria's character through the small talk she engages James with, but there are certain things she comments on which feels ridiculously on the nose. Just let the player soak in the details for themselves. Like, I don't need some corny dialogue pointing out how James looks when saving, or how intently he stares at the paintings in Brookhaven to solve the padlock puzzle. The original had a few moments like this, most notably with James's comment on the mannequin you find the flashlight attached to, so it would be wrong of me not to be a little perturbed by its usage there, since obviously these look like Mary's clothes, like you don't need to be told that, but it's more bothersome in the remake because they vocally comment on things so the player doesn't miss it. It's for a similar reason that I don't care for the execution of the glimpses of the past. A lot of puzzles and notable locations were moved around in the remake, and so the glimpses of the past act as callbacks to the original versions of these places. You can see the scratches on the wall from where the original grandfather clock was, or Heaven's Night, the coin puzzle, the Brookhaven lockbox, and much more. On its own, that's fine. I actually think it's really cool they'd go through the effort of leaving these callbacks around, but the fact that they're interactable and play this jingle that screams to the player, "Hey, look, it's the thing that was in the original in the same way! Look, see, look!" That's what bugs me. Just leave these as Easter eggs. This is more of a nitpick, but I feel like it'd be much cooler to let the player figure it out on their own, rather than spelling it out to them. Moving on though, the new voice actors do a fine job of recapturing the original characters, for the most part. I've been seeing people calling Guy Kihi's James voice much worse than Luke Roberts, and I can't agree with that entirely. Luke does deliver a nuanced performance, which is helped a lot by the updated motion capture and scene direction. Like, you can tell James is in a near constant state of disassociation or otherwise mental torment in the remake. I've noticed a lot of criticism in general towards the original voice cast, but you have to remember that these weren't professional voice actors. While that might sound like a problem, for Silent Hill 2 it's incredibly charming because this town is supposed to be strange, attracting even stranger and troubled people. Of course, I never expected the voice direction to stay the same in the remake, but the new cast at least tries to stay somewhat faithful to the original performances while still giving their own spin. I don't think it's all bad, to be clear. I can see what they're going for, but in a lot of cases it comes off very strange. Maria is the most notable example, where in the original James wasn't sure if he should trust her because from the get-go there was something very clearly off about her. The way she talked, how she looked at him, and how she looks and sounds uncannily similar to Mary.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
No, my late wife. I can't believe it. You could be her twin.
In the remake, she comes off friendlier, still teasing James here and there, but she doesn't have quite the same personality. Maria was always supposed to be James's ideal version of Mary, and there's something inherently creepy about seeing that desire realized. This is furthered by the side story Born from a Wish, where we see Maria as a very real woman who has autonomy, has real feelings, and questions her purpose, only finding her reason to live when she meets James. Throughout the main game, she loses more and more of her autonomy and comes to realize her only purpose is to serve another person's story. And I'm not sure if I like the new direction for Maria because of this, because her most important scenes feel much less impactful. The prison cell scene in particular really doesn't sit right with me, because this is the point where James realizes that something really isn't right. He saw her die only a few hours ago, and so to see her here again shouldn't be possible.
James, honey, did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
Maria?
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
It's an incredibly unsettling scene which hits the moment that "I'm not your Mary" comes out. This is what blurs the line between Mary and Maria. She says it with such vitriol that it's clear she knows much more than she lets on. It recontextualizes their first cutscene in such a creepy way, showing just how manipulative she really is. The problem with Remake Maria is her VA clearly went for a more calm and collected approach to seem more natural. Maria and natural are two things that just should not mix, I'm sorry. She's a person created specifically for James by Silent Hill. She naturally would come off unnatural. Remake Maria just doesn't have that same mystique surrounding her, which likely was the idea, done to catch you off guard even more once you see her again in the prison cell, but even then the remake prison scene is too different from the original for that to work.
James? Honey? Did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
Maria?
You said you took everything. But you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
Maria already sounds pissed off at James with how condescending her tone is, and the delivery of "I'm not your Mary" has no venom whatsoever. The one saving grace here is James because he is so visibly in pain, but saying that only half the scene is as good as the original isn't much of a compliment. Angela and Eddie I ended up having the least issues with. Eddie's voice actor feels the most like he did his homework on the character, and whether he did or not, I love Scott Haning's take on Eddie.
Hey, who's there?
It wasn't me. I didn't do it. I didn't do it, I swear.
What elevated Eddie for me, more so than the others, were some other changes made to his scenes. Eddie was previously more subtle in the original, becoming one of the most sinister characters in a cutscene that seems pretty sudden. In retrospect, it makes more sense why Eddie suddenly goes nuts, but he hardly seemed bothered by what Laura and James said to him earlier in the game. Eddie feels like he can't trust James or anyone else because he's always been made fun of for his weight. In the remake, you can see the turning point for Eddie in the theater scene just after James's comment about getting his appetite back. He already doesn't trust him, which explains his annoyance when James suggests going after Laura together. As much as I love David Chappelle's Eddie, I found him harder to take seriously in his more sinister moments because he feels inherently goofier, while Scott Haning takes a more grounded approach. Both versions work for their games, but it's interesting to see him taken further in this direction. It certainly makes his boss fight more tense. Once again, top tier job on the Eddie fight. I will never not praise the remake for this. My only issue with Angela is one of the new cutscenes added to further nail in the point that she doesn't like being touched when this is something that's already established when we meet her again at the apartment. Otherwise, I don't mind the new cutscenes. It's neat to see a few new things here and there. Thankfully, the core story remains untouched. There are just some new details thrown in to add more depth to James with some of the new memos, as well as his and Mary's trips to Silent Hill through the strange photographs. I've heard that some of the new stuff builds off of the Silent Hill 2 novelization, which, if true, is honestly really cool, and it shows a lot of passion on Bloober Team's part. Overall, though, I unfortunately can't say that I loved the Silent Hill 2 remake quite as much as everyone else seems to. I'd honestly say it suffers the most from its extended playtime because this game has no business being as long as it is. People will complain about games being priced above $50 if they're less than 20 hours long, like please be serious. That being said, I certainly don't like SH2 being priced at $70, much less any AAA games. Unfortunately, I think this was always going to be the best case scenario for a Silent Hill 2 remake. It could have been better for sure, but there are so many ways it could have gone worse. Konami doesn't even seem to know what they want to do with this series half the time, so while I'm interested in Silent Hill F and Townfall, I don't know how much faith I have in them. It seems like this series will forever be passed between developers, so who knows what we're in store for next. As for Bloober Team, they've already announced their next project, which is an original survival horror game. Looks pretty neat, but I'll have to keep an eye on where things go from here. Bloober Team has promised no more shitty games though, so surely this time, for real they'll get it. I believe. If you're really curious about whether to play SH2 OG or the remake, it depends on what you're interested in this game for. If it's the story, then go for the OG game. While the core of the story remains the same, the presentation is weaker, mostly due to the voice direction. If you think the atmosphere is cool, I'd say it's a coin toss. Both versions look great in their own right. There are some really good looking shots on the remake, and seeing the town remade in such high quality is one of the best parts of the game. I really don't care for how loud the game gets at points though, like it doesn't let you sink in the atmosphere quite as much as the original did thanks to some of the frankly loud music and sound effects. Especially in those fog storm segments, those could have been really cool. There's also just something I love about the original's fixed camera perspective, which I think is missing here. It's cool that so many people are being introduced to Silent Hill through the remake, but I hope this leads to more people trying out the original because while it is rough around the edges, it's an incredibly charming and thought-provoking experience, even to this day. I mean, obviously, there's a reason why it has a remake. Me personally, I do not want another remake. I'd much rather see more new content, but with the success of SH2, I wouldn't be surprised if another was in the pipeline. Only time will tell, but till then, I've been Wyrlwind, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.